Bitcoin is close to becoming worthless.
Let's go. Now, what's the Bitcoin?
Bitcoin's like rat poison.
Yeah. Oh,
The greatest scam in history.
let's get it.
Bitcoin will go to fucking zero.
Yeah.
Alright, you ungovernable misfits. I'm your host, Max. Everybody knows that Bitcoin is useless, worthless, and doomed to fail. But what if everyone's wrong? What if it's the system that is doomed to fail? Join me as I speak to some of the brightest people in the space and slither to the deepest, darkest depths of the Bitcoin rabbit hole. In true bit-by-bit fashion, today my internet is down, I can't connect to anything, my laptop won't work on my 4G. I think it's actually the laptop just being a fucking arsehole. It just will not, it lies and says that it's connected, but it isn't actually connected. So I can't look at the show notes, I can't look at anything, but I can tell you that this episode was fucking incredible. Me and John invited on Bassload, our energy market update and Pleb Miner Mafia crew member. We also invited Troy Cross from the Bitcoin Policy Institute to talk all things energy and mining. It was really good to hear from both of these guys with different perspectives, and John with the intro. Oh, so smooth as always. Anyway, I'm now going to try and work out how the fuck to get this uploaded. I'm going to put it on a memory stick or something and then use someone else's computer. I don't know, I'll work it out. Very quickly, before we dive in, I want to say a quick thank you to Foundation Devices. Foundation Devices keep this show running. They have been supporting me for the last couple of years and it is much appreciated. I chased after them, not the other way around, because I desperately wanted to work with them. I absolutely love the products they're making and their team is awesome. They actually care about Bitcoin and open source technologies. They are making it so simple and accessible for anyone. I love the fact that I can go out and speak to friends and family and confidently say, yeah, get yourself this hardware wallet, you'll be able to use it, I can help you. It's piss easy, it's open source, it is cypherpunk tools for fuckwits. If you haven't already checked out the passport, go and have a look. It's absolutely beautifully designed. Go to foundationdevices.com. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. If they're really technical ones, you can reach out to Q&A. And finally, a big thank you to sx6.store. sx6.store? What the fuck is that, you might be thinking? Doesn't sound like Bitcoin-y, it sounds like maybe some sleazy shitty porn site. I don't know what it is. I'll tell you what it is. They sell stainless steel backup plates. You need these. And I'll tell you why you need these. If you write down your 12 or 24 words and your passphrase on a bit of paper and you lose it, or it burns, or it gets wet, you're fucked. So if you're storing your wealth and you're taking Bitcoin seriously and this is your money and your freedom money and blah 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 and all that, you want to make sure that you keep it with marine grade 316L stainless steel. This will survive fires, floods, and just about everything else that can be thrown at it. These things are, from memory, I don't have internet, but from memory, I think 25 quid. You can also use my shill code. I can't remember what it is. I think it's BitBuyBit. You can reach out to them. They'll sort you out anyway. They'll give you a discount. I think you get 10% off. Or reach out to me, and when I have internet, I'll sort it out for you. But if you don't already have these, fucking sort your life out and get one. Go to sx6.store. Right, enjoy the show. And a huge, huge thank you to Bass, Troy Cross, and John.
Welcome to a very special episode of Bit by Bit. I'm your co-host, John DiGiacomo. With me, as always, is Max Bit by Bit. head honcho of the BitBuyBit radio empire. On with us is energy expert, Bitcoin Bassload, and philosopher and Bitcoin enthusiast, Troy Cross. Join us for a fireside chat where we talk all things energy and Bitcoin in a segment we are calling Bass and Treble. Grid Harmony. Welcome, gentlemen.
What an intro.
Wow.
Excellent. I am ready to go now.
Troy, do you recognize that piece of music?
I do recognize the piece. It's something I play. I don't know if that's me playing it or not.
That is indeed you playing, sir.
Oh my God. I'm so impressed with myself.
You thought that was a professional recording.
I mean, it could have been, right? It was like just lousy enough that it could have been. I'll take it.
I liked it. Yeah.
That's I think a French suite, one of the French suites.
That's
By
what you
Bach.
said.
Yeah.
Can we just clear up where you got this recording, John? Were you stalking and lurking in the cupboard, or where did you?
I actually enrolled in one of Troy's classes.
Yeah, okay.
That really hot girl in the back of the class you've been eyeballing, Troy.
That was you.
That's me, bro.
Push up bra.
Let's just not merge these two worlds of mine.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Moving on to energy. The reason that we've brought both of you guys together here is you have very different perspectives on energy, but they're both passionate perspectives. So Bitcoin Bassload had the idea to bring you on the show, and he wants to rap with you about energy. And I hope that you want to rap with us about energy as well, Troy.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. I'm excited to be here. You know, I am a philosopher. I'm an academic philosopher. And we don't generally know much about the world of energy, power, electricity at all. It's not something we discuss in my discipline, but it's something I found myself pulled into as a Bitcoiner. So I'm happy to, and of course I've got opinions, I've got reasons, I've got a lot to say, but what I don't have is like real world expertise. So I'm always happy to learn from people who do.
Max and I have figured out a way to make that work. He's very good at privacy stuff. I'm good at mining stuff. So when one is talking about the other, then the other person becomes the philosopher, and we switch back and forth.
There you go.
So I think it's good to challenge those assumptions sometimes, even when you think you're the expert on something, to come from a philosophical standpoint and just ask a simple, pointed question. I think somebody who's in the weeds all the time, as Bassload likes to say, it might pull them out of the weeds for a second to kind of take a higher level view and challenge their assumptions. Speaking of Bitcoin Bassload, hi, buddy.
Good evening.
And why are we here today?
We're here because energy is life. Without it, we have problems. And I just want things to work. I'm okay with being wrong. And most people, I would think, also want things to work. So we're trying to understand the how. How is this done? How are things priced? How do things work in the energy, electricity world? It is a very complex, and certainly we can go down many rabbit holes this evening, but I'm very excited to be with Troy because he makes me think more than just traditional stuff that I've thought about and learned about over the years of my career in energy.
Can you go over with us what your career is? We always kind of say Bitcoin Bassload energy market expert.
Yeah, I thought he was a pro skater.
Yeah.
It's all I ever see you do, mate.
I do love the skateboard. That is the thing. However, sure, I've been an energy consultant for 8 years. And what that really means is I advise clients on a number of different, strategy in regards to the procurement of electricity and natural gas, the physical buying and purchasing in markets that you're allowed to do that in. Because there's plenty different strategies. I help them understand those. I help them understand the markets that they're in, the market construct, what you're able to do, what you're not able to do. I bring the counterparties together, suppliers meeting with and marrying customers, consumers of electricity and natural gas. based on the strategy that we would provide them on their load consumption or their energy consumption. I help them understand demand response related activities. I help them understand macro energy economics, micro energy economics. I help them understand utility tariffs. I help them and advise them on different ways to effectively and efficiently procure the different commodities that I've been focused on, which is electricity and natural gas, and helping all of that strategy get printed on a contract. So I also, do all of the terms and conditions type of negotiations between the two parties, suppliers and consumers. And that's nuanced, but it's a thing because the strategy means nothing unless it's in writing. So I do that and do a lot of market intelligence all over the place, North America, even sometimes, overseas. And electricity and natural gas has been my specialty, if you will.
In electricity markets, you have a generation fleet, and then you have the cost that's going to cost the electricity generator, and then you have the price that somebody is going to purchase that.
Mm-hmm.
So given that that's your wheelhouse, right? Could you explain the auction process for us? And then I think from there we can kind of branch off and find out who's making the energy and who's buying the energy.
Are we going to let Troy introduce himself also?
Troy did introduce himself.
Oh, so we'll have to edit this out too, I guess.
We're not doing any editing, mate. You fucked it.
Well then.
You let me run the pod, pal.
All right. Can I go skate now? This is dumb. No. No. Okay, so there are consumers of electricity and natural gas, okay? Anybody with a meter and account number, they're buying retail power, or more technically electricity or natural gas. If any of the machines in the facility, whether it's a industrial facility that I focused on and help clients mostly with on that side, or just a residential home, whether the devices are powered by electric energy or powered by natural gas, there is a price for that, and it's in a retail fashion, right? So you understand the kind of economics between wholesale, retail stuff. So the flow of the price, you have a generation or a power plant, generation asset that produces or generates electricity from a certain fuel type, right? So it could be coal, could be nuclear, could be wind, solar, could be the water, hydro, could be biofuel, okay, all different kinds. And there is a price associated with generating that electricity. There's a price for the fuel. Coal costs a certain price, nuclear costs a certain price, natural gas, obviously, which is the most common used fuel for electricity in most markets today in North America anyway, it has definitely a certain price. And generating that electricity, there's a wholesale market from the generator to, wholesale entities. And wholesale entities are more like the retail electric providers, okay, which are, I call them suppliers. They're sometimes banks, hedge funds, anybody that has great credit worthiness and great credit requirements to function. And there's rules and regulations associated with who can transact in wholesale and who can't. And then that energy, electric energy, in the electric energy example, will then get sold back to the consumer, right? So flows from power plant to wholesale market to retail market, right? And, the folks, it's a common misconception that people say I can buy wholesale power or wholesale electricity or, wholesale natural gas. All of that is false because it all flows into the consumer as a retail product. And there's language with contracts associated, so you can see, even though, okay, the contract says I can buy what would be described as locational marginal pricing of electric energy or a regional pipeline price for natural gas, right? That, although is a component, because there's many inside of the price, there's multiple layers of it. It's not a true wholesale purchase, because if you would buy the wholesale energy cost, you're still having retail components, which we can get into later, that ultimately end up on your bill. Okay. There's no line item that says wholesale energy or wholesale electric energy, wholesale natural gas. That's not a thing. So that's kind of the high level, very general overview from generator to consumer. And there's a couple of charts I could share with the flow of that. It flows through the wires, flows into the step down like a substation, right? Then continues to flow through more wires, step down. Generators generate power. They're traveling from anywhere from 69,000 volts all the way up to 745,000 volts, and sometimes even beyond that, slightly beyond that. But, you're not consuming electricity at your home at 74,000 volts. That's not going to fry your house. So, that needs to be stepped down, and that's kind of the generation to transmission to distribution funnel, right? But price related, it's from generator into the wholesale market. And that's in the ISO kind of RTO realm. There's other fancier things you could do, like bilateral transactions between, consumer.
Okay. All right. Well,
blah, blah, blah,
yeah.
whatever.
That's in the ISO RTO. Go over those very quickly, and then I want to get to Troy.
Okay. So RTO, Regional Transmission Organization. Well, RTO, Regional Transmission Organization, ISO, Independent System Operator.
So what you just laid out is relevant to those two structures.
Correct. In fact, these were designed by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. FERC originally designed RTOs and ISOs, these organizations and operators. They're kind of one and the same. It's a little nuanced and kind of semantics to kind of argue between if there's a difference or not. And FERC originally created these kind of in a response to, there was like an oil crisis. I have some notes here I could share, but essentially there was, in 96, the first RTO was created, and basically power pools became ISOs, and FERC had kind of control over how that's all organized and relevant to the market. And so they're essentially transmission operators that were able to compete in a wholesale market. PJM's one of them, Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, and there's multiple.
The long and short of this is that it is a complicated system, the whole pricing mechanism of electricity. It's not just tied to the cost of generation and delivery. But Troy has an interesting concept, and I suppose it's not particularly novel in this way, is that in Bitcoin mining, 70% of your expense is energy. Troy, you recently wrote an article for CoinDesk, and in it you have why Bitcoin miners will only use the world's cheapest electricity. So given the complicated nature of generation and generation mix with renewables and hydros and on-demand services, you say that Bitcoin miners are going to chase the cheapest forms of electricity. And do you think, Troy, that will have an effect on price in a way where generators and these pricing mechanisms change because of what Bitcoin miners are doing?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I'll step back a bit. The mechanisms that Base is describing are complex. I want to call them fiat. They are political organizations that determine price, that determine market structures, that determine pricing. And they're different depending on where you are and the convoluted history of bringing electricity to the general populace. What was going on in the region at the time, who was in charge, who got a piece of what. They're historical artifacts, and that's why there's no clean and simple way to understand them. Now, contrast Bitcoin. Bitcoin is really clean and simple, whatever people might say about it or complain about it. The basic concept of Bitcoin as an energy consumer is extremely simple. It's miners worldwide are chasing the block reward. The block reward is block subsidy plus transaction fees. And that's their entire revenue. Okay, maybe some of them are developing alternative revenue streams now that are minor, like selling ancillary services or selling waste heat or maybe getting carbon credits. But let's just set that aside. The pure picture of Bitcoin mining is very simple. All miners worldwide run basically the same machines. Anybody can buy the same machines, and they hash at the same rate, roughly. Of course, there are many other aspects of the business than plugging in a machine and running it. And we can get into that. But at its core, a machine, an S19 is an S19 running the same firmware. And so it's an amazingly perfect market for electricity. I think the first person I read who made this point really clearly was Haas McCook. one of his articles in Bitcoin Magazine from like 10 years ago, that there's never been a market as perfect as Bitcoin. And what that means is a perfect market. The good that is produced is fungible. Every Bitcoin's like every other Bitcoin. They're interchangeable. So you don't get like special made in America Bitcoin or whatever. And they're instantly transportable across space because the Bitcoin never leaves the blockchain. You know, the Bitcoin reside, if they reside anywhere, on the distributed ledger itself. So if you want to ship some Bitcoin to someone, you just make a transaction. The whole network updates, right? So you don't have any shipping costs. You have a fungible good that's identical. You have machines producing it that make it out of energy, so to speak, at the same rate. The efficiency of the machine is fixed. And you have a fixed reward. And this is unlike any other good in the world. Right now, it's 900 Bitcoin a day in the block subsidy. And there's nothing anybody can do about that until roughly next April. And that's all miners in the world have to split it. So it's not like, you know, you're mining gold in South Africa, but I can go mine some gold in Alaska and we'll just kind of add to the supply. It's like there's one chunk of Bitcoin in the center of the earth and all miners are going after it, except, you know, it's a daily chunk or really a block by block chunk. So now if we think, okay, how does this market behave given that it's perfect, nearly perfect? Of course, there are differences I've ignored. Well, what does the econ textbook say about a perfect market? It says that in a perfect market, margins drop to zero. There's basically a very low barrier to entry in a perfect market. Profit margins go to zero in any perfect market. And the only thing that keeps any business really from going to zero profit margin is the barriers to entry and the imperfection of the market. So the most perfect market really should have like the lowest margins in theory. And now if you look at the expense side of Bitcoin, it's 70%, 60%, 80%, depends on who you ask and how they run their business. But it's largely energy as the number one expense. The hypothesis is, it's kind of obvious. If that's your biggest expense and it's a perfect market, it's like perfectly competitive, you're going to see that industry move to the cheapest power in the world. Because if they don't, all somebody has to do is get some of these identical machines from Bitmain and plug them in where the energy is the cheapest.
Mm-hmm.
Once some miners are on the margin, then if there's cheaper power elsewhere, as soon as you plug in those machines, the difficulty adjusts upward. The marginal miner goes out of business. If there's no friction at all, there's nothing to worry about with jurisdictional risk, whatever. You can always make more money if you can find cheaper power. Of course, I'm simplifying here, but that's the overall picture. And then I'm going to just step back and wait because maybe Bassload wants to jump in here. But what does that do to electricity markets is a much, much more complicated question. But I think that first part is like, I'm just rock solid on that. Any perfect market where the primary input is electricity and it has very low barriers to entry will find the cheapest electricity in the world. Maybe that electricity will be cheap because it's subsidized. Maybe it'll be cheap because it's stranded. Maybe it'll be cheap because of transmission constraints. I don't know why it's cheap. And maybe it's cheap because of technology, because there's some technological breakthrough that makes energy in a very cheap way. But when that is your number one input in a perfect market, you can always gain an advantage over your competitors by finding cheaper energy. And an advantage isn't like, oh, gee, I have an advantage. No, it's a zero-sum game because of the fixed supply. So when you have an advantage over time, somebody else is going to go out of business because we're in a super low margin business. That part of the thesis, I think, it's like a fact. It should be like, it should be a common assumption for everybody before we even begin getting into the weeds of controversy. And I think it's totally independent of how electricity pricing actually works. Like if you have some screwed up market that doesn't really price electricity in an efficient way that reflects the physics, that reflects supply and demand, like Bitcoin doesn't care. If it's priced too high, then Bitcoiners be like, okay, we won't use it. If it's priced too low, Bitcoin will come in and eat it up. Bitcoin will just come in and suck up that inefficient pricing wherever it is. And we've seen that in a number of places, right? So anyway, that's I think the non-controversial side and the starting point. And basically the conclusion of that article was like, can we at least start here? All you like critics of Bitcoin, proponents of Bitcoin, Can we at least just get on the same page that ultimately price is going to drive where mining goes? And, there's a reason why that isn't a common ground right now. It's because people are ignorant of Bitcoin's underlying nature. They haven't thought it through. It's a brand new animal in the ecosystem of power users. There's never been anything like it. Portable, scalable, attenuable, interruptible, fungible, nothing like this. But also because historically we had a little episode, which is really fresh in everybody's mind, where the price of power was pretty much irrelevant. And that's when we had a huge spike in the price of Bitcoin, and we had a run up to 69,000 from, I don't know, a couple thousand. And then we had China ban mining, and China had half of the hash rate. So in that situation, you could profitably mine on any power that anybody was selling anywhere.
That was a unicorn times.
Exactly. That was a unicorn. But the problem was that unicorn is what, the Sierra Club saw when they saw fossil plants that were scheduled to close staying open and Bitcoin miners moving in there. And that's what the academics saw. And that's what lawmakers saw. And they're like, this is Bitcoin's nature. Bitcoin is a ravenous consumer of energy, and nothing limits its consumption. And, I was at this conference in Paris where somebody on stage with me from one of the shitcoins said, Bitcoin's going to build a Dyson sphere around the sun ultimately and consume all of the sun's energy, which was kind of based, but at the same time, it's like, well, how is this going to work exactly with the halving every 4 years? Where's the money going to come from to build the Dyson sphere?
Yeah, well, so many of the boil the oceans arguments fall flat because they're so hyperbolic.
They're incredibly bullish. I mean, they're incredibly bullish. Bitcoin's price has to double every 4 years in order for its security budget, or whatever you want to call it, let's say the block subsidy, to remain of the same value in energy terms, the ability to buy energy. It has to double in price every 4 years. If you think that the energy consumption of Bitcoin is only and always ever going up, you are either a laser-eyed maxi or you're an environmentalist critic. Right? They're the only people who think that.
Max, you have your hand up.
I do. Do you like how polite I am today?
Yeah, it's very British of you.
I just had a couple of thoughts. Firstly, I completely agree with what Troy's saying there. Like, in terms of Bitcoin miners are going to seek out the lowest cost energy because that makes running their business the most efficient. It's an obvious thing they're going to do, but what I would think is that sometimes when you're looking at what is perceived to be cheap energy, cheap isn't always cheap, because if there's jurisdictional risk or some other risk, something that seems cheap can suddenly become very expensive very fast. I assume, and Base will probably go into this, that presumably has to be factored in. And then the other thing which we've seen in Pleb Miner Monthly and with all the stuff going on is that sometimes people are actually offsetting the cost of their energy against their waste heat being repurposed, and that can bring up their efficiency. So I wondered if Base has any sort of thoughts on that, and whether that means that there's some hope that we actually have these smaller, less attackable miners, rather than just it being the big boys coming in with the most money, getting contracts at the lowest rates, and it makes it near impossible in the future for smaller pleb miners, because that would be an issue.
That's a great assessment, Max.
Why, thank you.
I think, again, it really interests me because, as Troy was mentioning, if you're a consumer of electricity and it is your main cost, okay, it's not even an operating expense, it's like a cost of goods sold, the very gross profit margin is and can be manipulated based on the price of electricity in Bitcoin mining world, right? You have to, in fact, you must be forced to understand what you're discussing, Max, about how is it priced. Okay. I've used many examples, and John, beats a dead horse out of it a lot, with any type of commodity you're looking at, whether you own a pizza shop or, a tire manufacturer or whatever. If you're a pizza shop, you probably want to understand the price of tomatoes, the price of dough, and the price of cheese. If you don't understand that, how are you going to sell a large pizza for $15 or $20 or whatever it costs in the UK, right?
$1,000 for a pizza in the UK.
Right. And so I use that example. It's a kind of a general example, but still, I mean, you have to, any pizza shop, the plastics manufacturer, I mean, they are very price sensitive. They have to be because their competitors are also price sensitive, right? So if I sell a pizza for $15 and I find out that, they're selling pizza for $15 when I'm selling a pizza for $20 because my tomato guy can't get me a cheaper tomato, obviously this guy's, either he's doing something in a financial transactional way that's he's manipulating that price, or, he's receiving costs at a different price than I am. So knowing how things are priced with electricity, again, is very complex. You have to know the market and you need the transparency in the market. And I feel like a lot of folks fall on their face with this, because how many of all of us have been in conversations with people that they spun up a Bitcoin mining operation and 4 months later they're defaulting on electricity contracts because defaulting on electricity contracts, and or they're in a, there's two different types of markets. You can, there's a choice market, which is what I would describe as a deregulated market, where the customer, the consumer, has the ability to choose what strategy you want to buy, and this is the kind of stuff that I deal with on a daily basis, where, you can decide what type of strategy you'd like to use to purchase electricity, what type of supplier, which supplier is best, right? All of that stuff. You could do that, or you're in a vertically integrated market, regulated market, where you have no choice. The price is 10 cents a kilowatt hour, the end. And then we'll change it. We'll do rate case filings with public utility commissions and all like that. And we set the rate and you go. I mean, how many times have we talked to people that have said, either A, I didn't know how it was priced. I thought I chose correctly in a deregulated market. I didn't. And now, I'm on my face. Or the tariff has changed, right? The tariff has changed, and the rate-based filing has gone through, and now it's impacted me negatively, meaning the price went up instead of down. So if I had a nickel for every time somebody, literally 1 sat, actually, to be more pointed here. If I had 1 sat for every person I've talked to with that, I'd have a whole Bitcoin, right? It's really crazy.
That's a lot of people.
It is. I'm serious. There is a lot of folks. Maybe not quite 100 million, but still, there's a lot of people. Maybe that was slightly exaggerated. By my apologies.
It's all right.
It feels like that.
I just started writing zeros here on a piece of paper.
It feels that way because, when people talk to me, they ask me what I do, and they go through that whole thing we talked about earlier. They go into these horror stories, right? And I'm actually trying to prevent that, because there is a level of transparency that I and many others like me can provide folks with, knowing the market construct, knowing, okay, you're in Iowa, right? Or you're in New Jersey, or you're in California, or you're in Alberta, Canada, or you're in the UK, right? Wherever it is, there's a tariff to read. There's a market design to understand if it's in an ISO, independent system operator, right? You can understand that. You could see the ways that you can transact with electricity. Guys, it really just comes down to reading stuff, right? But the problem is the stuff that you're reading. These tariffs are 400 pages sometimes, okay? And now you don't have to read the 400 pages. You kind of get to the meat of the stuff. But even reading that, kilowatt divided by kilowatt hours, right? What does that mean? All these weird buzzwords that people use all the time that I melt people's faces with. It's just very complicated.
It's not sexy. Right. Hearing you and Troy speak side by side, when Troy's talking about all these concepts of miners being cheapskates and chasing the cheapest energy, and just doesn't that make sense? It's really speaking from a logical perspective, from an engineering and technical perspective in a way too, because you have generators. You have the different fuels that a generator may use. They have a delivery system, and then you have a user. Right. And that's kind of fun to talk about for Bitcoiners, and it's simple for people to talk about. And then when you come into the mix, and I'm not meaning this to insult you whatsoever, but it is so complicated and in the weeds and not sexy and technical. that you almost just wanted to say, like, will anybody please listen to me? We have a fantastic looking flat load shape, and you know exactly what we want to take. And can you just skim off all of this bullshit and we just talk about the physical grid instead of getting into the policy grid? How do we simplify that, Troy and Base? How do we kind of skim off all of this bullshit?
The problem is you can't do this.
I mean, here's the one thought I have, and this is not my question really, it's for Base, but the one way to do it is to just produce your own power. And you know, if you build a power plant on your property and it's not even hooked up to the grid, then you got a direct cost of like your inputs, your capex, and your output, which is electricity. Then you're free of all this. But I think that's really hard to do. And I've asked some power people, even, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Base, about like, well, am I allowed to just, you know, throw down a power plant? And it's not so simple. You know, you have to get it permitted. You know, they want you to be part of the system. What I've learned is that, you know, the Bitcoiner impulse is to be a sovereign individual. And that means, you know, you're sovereign with respect to your money. But energy, it's very difficult to be a sovereign individual with respect to energy. The grid is a public good. The reason it's so messy is because it serves the public, you know, and the actions that individual actor takes, whether they're a consumer or a generator or whatever role they play in this many layered system, you know, the distributor, the wholesale market, whatever, the Public Utility Commission, every one of these like entities serves that public good in a system that works together. And so you have to coordinate those actors with regulations if you want the grid to function, and you want to not just for it to function, but like for it to reliably function in a guaranteed way so that when anybody flips on any device, there's power there for them at that time, and the system works as efficiently as possible to deliver that good, right? So there's the clean part of my mind that I, you know, it's really like the Econ 101 analysis of Bitcoin, like, hey, it's going to seek out cheap power. This should be easy, runs up against the reality of the grid as a public good and the pricing as highly regulated. Even when there are markets, those markets are really regulated.
Yep.
To protect that public good and price it fairly. And this is also where we have a lot of controversy, of course, because there are lots of things we can do to negatively or positively affect that grid. And then there's an open question of like, how much should we get compensated for that? You know, if you're stabilizing the grid or destabilizing it, how much should you be rewarded or should you pay for that? And that's ultimately going to be politically mediated. So we'll never get away from these kinds of conversations instead of like just addressing things in the hash war. You know, like I think like the appropriate way for Bitcoiners to address things is like by mining. You know, it's like you want mining to be done a certain way, do it that way. I wrote a paper with Andrew Bailey, you know, saying that's our ethos. But in general for Bitcoin, you want a software, you want the software to be updated in a certain respect. Well, there is a way for you to submit your updates. There's a way for you to change the software you run on your node, right? Like just do it. Let's hash and let's let the chips fall where they may. That's the Bitcoiner way. But I think with power, it's not as simple. It's not so simple because it's a public good. It will always be politically mediated and messy.
So the very easy and very simple answer I could give to you, Troy, about what you just said,
Yeah,
is that we do not make those rules. We do not make the rules that allow electricity markets to function the way that they do because they've been designed a certain way to satisfy what other humans deem as the appropriate way to transact, whether it's in an ISO, whether it's in a vertically integrated utility or a vertically integrated regulated market.
Just go over that real quick. Base, the vertically integrated system, please.
That's basically the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity is all done by one entity. They tell you how we're going to generate electricity, what fuel we're going to use, what wires are available, what size voltage those wires are, how it's transmitted through the wires, all the way into a local distribution company's distribution network. So the high voltage down to the lower voltage or medium to lower voltage, and then delivered through distribution lines to you. All of those are done by one entity, right? Vertically integrated. They own everything. And I wanted to kind of get back to what I was talking about FERC, because FERC is, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I mean, these are the folks that kind of gave the leeway for ISIS to come in, RTOs to be created, right? In my notes, and you could certainly share these with the folks listening.
We'll post up all of these notes. When Mr. Crown posts this on the Ungovernable Biscuits website, we'll include a few links to Troy's articles, the Mine Your Values one and the Miners Chasing Cheap Electricity. And we'll also link these notes that you've sent, Base, because they're very thorough and detailed. And if you want to talk about electricity, you should probably have these in front of you.
So there's certain things that FERC does and FERC does not do, right? I can go into details there, but essentially, like I was saying before, I mean, FERC was created due to a response to the oil crisis in 1973, okay? And they passed the Department of Energy Organization Act of 1977. The DOE, the Department of Energy, was born. And then fast forward, okay, to 1996, Order 888 was issued, and RTOs, regional transmission organizations, came into the mix in response to the Energy Policy Act in 1992, okay? So that allowed this kind of wholesale marketplace to be born. Some of the traditional markets were southeast, north, southwest, northwest, all that. But my point is, with all of that, and like here's a good example. FERC, they what FERC does, they regulate transmission wholesale sale of electricity and interstate commerce. They regulate the transmission and sale of natural gas for resale and interstate commerce. They license and inspect private, municipal, and state hydroelectric projects. And that's just some example. FERC what they don't do, they don't regulate nuclear power plants. They don't issue state water quality certifications. And they don't regulate retail electricity and natural gas sales to consumers. Okay? See the difference? They regulate the wholesale, but they don't regulate the retail. So my point is, all of this is that there are rules in place, gentlemen, that one has to follow to achieve cheap electricity. If one doesn't know the rules and, again, the market construct of which you're in, how are you going to know that Bitcoin is the buyer of last resort for electricity, that they always are going to consume electricity? In fact, to Troy's point earlier, most of the local distribution companies, the utilities, generators, I mean, they just view this as another consumer. Generally speaking, some are kind of getting their, and again, this is all very new to a lot of these folks, right? They're still trying to learn. There's people out there really going after, public utility commissions, local distribution companies, generators, even, to explain to them the benefits of this really good consumer of electricity called Bitcoin mining or Bitcoin miners. But to them, they're thinking, okay, well, now I got to run more wires to deliver to these people. I got to spin up another generator to deliver a metric shit ton of electricity to them. So now we have to figure out how a new consumer, because they're just, some of these guys, not all, okay, but some of them just view them as like another industrial load. And I don't see the issue with that really, because in fact, if you're sizable, to me, anything over, 5 megawatts of consumption for electricity is a large consumer, okay? It just is. All right. There's a lot of physical stuff that needs to happen in order to bring that 5 megawatts to the consumer, right? All the way through that process we talked about earlier. So again, FERC instituted some rules. There's rules at the PUC, the Public Utility Commission level. Every state's got one. It may not be called a Public Utility Commission, but there's other terms for that. Every state's got it. Okay. And those, like what Troy was saying, those are for the people, right? We're not going to, say you're in a deregulated market, like say you live in Ohio or Illinois or well, not really all of Illinois, but let's say New Jersey, for example, right? Deregulated market. You can go to the utility commission and say, you know what? There's a problem with my bill. And I believe that there's some scandalous or nefarious stuff going on, I'd like you to create a case, open a case for me, because I want further research done towards what I believe is a wrongdoing here, right? They're for the people, but guess who they're also for, these utility commissions? They're for the utilities also, right? So not only are they there for the people, but they're there for the utilities. And what are utilities always run by? Rules and regulations. The regulatory side is huge for energy, right? Because it makes the market construct work in a way. I'm not saying it works great, okay? That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying it works in a way that all of us plebs have to adhere to, okay? We have to run this. You can't, as much as Troy would want to say, and I don't disagree with you, Troy, to be honest. I mean, heck, I would love to have my own electric generation, in my backyard. I mean, that would be great. That's a sovereign way of thinking, right? But there's rules in place to not allow that to go down in the way that maybe you as the pleb would want it to go down, right? Say I wanted a 5 megawatt gas turbine in my backyard, right? Or a megawatt. Say I wanted to have 1,000 kW natural gas fired. I have gas. I live in, Erie, Pennsylvania. I have all this gas. It's all over the place, right? Shale land. Okay. I want to put 1,000 kW electric generation asset that is fueled by natural gas on my property. You know what I have to do? I have to ask people if I could do this.
Sure.
Right? And that's the whole, the rules part, man. It's just, either you want to play by the rules or you want to say, I don't want to play by the rules, and the end, right?
Sure. Case in point here, recently Stronghold wanted to burn tires in Pennsylvania, similar to what they were doing, burning that excess coal. And everyone was up in arms. I don't know the process for them recycling the tires and burning it. I imagine they've probably figured out a way where it's not exactly like on The Simpsons with the great tire fire burning in the middle of town. I'm sure they've figured out some things. But here's them trying to generate their own electricity, and they're bumping up against regulations, and they're bumping up against the community because they don't like the phrase burning tires. How do we get over things like that, Troy? Even if you had a small hydro dam, well, now you're, all rivers and streams lead to a larger body of water, that you're always in some way going to butt up against these regulatory commissions.
I mean, some of this is like Bitcoin itself is permissionless and global. So you're describing a whole set of regulations that's local to a jurisdiction. And if that jurisdiction is saying no to something that physically makes sense, chances are there's some other jurisdiction on the planet that will say yes.
Like Springfield.
Yes, exactly. Actually, the tire thing is interesting because it's like so many. It's much like Stronghold's main business of waste coal remediation, burning tires, incinerating tires in a controlled environment is considered one way of remediating the environmental hazard of waste tires. PRTI is already doing it to mine Bitcoin in another state, but it sounds bad. Kind of like burning waste coal also sounds bad. Before you look into it deeply and realize it's polluting the air, it's polluting the water and the ground, and it's off-gassing CO2 and many other harmful gases just lying there. Some of it is actually burning in Pennsylvania, slowly. And that waste coal is the legacy of 150, 200 years of coal development that basically powered the history of this country, including and most notably when Pennsylvania hit its peak in World War II, where it built the military, the skyscrapers, many of the skyscrapers, over in Asia and in Japan and Korea, right? Like U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, like that. This is just like so many stories. Bitcoin exposes a kind of deep facts about the power system, the way our energy system, and I agree that energy is life. It's what makes the entire world that we live in possible. Without it, it's almost hard to imagine how quickly civilization would collapse and population would collapse down to like subsistence farming, levels, but that energy system does impact our world in various ways that are unpleasant or harmful, locally, and all forms of energy production have impacts. All forms of human economic activity have impacts on the environment. So Bitcoin comes along as this kind of flashpoint, and it's not just that it interacts with existing rules. If it were just treated like any other load, I think it would be fine, but it isn't. It's treated specially. It's like this new scary thing called Bitcoin, and the kind of normal ways in which we impact our environment all the time are only seen or highlighted once Bitcoin enters the picture, right? I mean, as I see it, like central Pennsylvania is this like side effect of the incredible American economic engine through the last 200 years, and that waste coal that Stronghold is dealing with imperfectly, but there isn't a perfect way to deal with it. It's impacting the people who live in those regions, and most of the time we just ignore it. I say we, not the people who live there, obviously, but I mean coastal environmentalists like myself, right? So I mean, Bitcoin has just got a way of revealing this. And in terms of where it goes and how it deals with all these rules, I mean, this is kind of the amazing thing. There's never been a tool of carbon arbitrage or regulatory arbitrage that is better than Bitcoin, because normally the way you want to regulate against something, some kind of externality in your local your local state, you pass a law that either prohibits that activity, or adds a tax onto it, and then you can prohibit or tax imports for other countries that produce the same good, right? That's the Pigouvian tax structure. With Bitcoin, you can't stop its production anywhere. You can't even change the amount of Bitcoin that's produced. Right? It's algorithmically fixed, and that fixes the global reward. So if you ban it locally, you have no effect on the global expenditure of energy for Bitcoin whatsoever. You might affect it in the first few weeks, but just like when China banned and we bounced back, it'll come back. You can't control how much Bitcoin mining there is. And then because Bitcoin is fungible and because it's transmitted on the blockchain itself, you cannot tax it with a tariff like coming across the border. You can't stop it at the border and say, oh, you're a Bitcoin coming from elsewhere. We've banned Bitcoin mining, so you can't come in here, or we've taxed it, so you have to pay a tax. So it's a carbon arbitrage tool. And I think, going back to an earlier point, even the jurisdictions that make it hard to mine Bitcoin, whether that's through funky ways they price electricity or just outright bans or whatever, if there is physical energy that's not being used in some location around the world, let's take a large dam that's controlled by a corrupt government that also is threatened by Bitcoin, so they make Bitcoin illegal. This describes China. This maybe describes other places. They still have excess energy, and there's nothing stopping that government themselves from mining with that cheap energy, like bypassing the bullshit rules, making it Bitcoin, and then just selling it on the open market and using fiat while forbidding people from doing that. So like my hypothesis is, of course, jurisdictional risk matters. All this stuff matters. But ultimately, it's about the energy cost of energy, right? Not the fiat cost. Just ultimately, our world has a fiat layer and a legal layer, but at the bottom, it's physics. Like, food requires fertilizer to grow. Planes require jet fuel to make it from point A to point B. Machines require electricity to run. And if your political scheme is not allowing a perfectly fungible good that is mined in a uniform way to be mined where the energy is scarcest, okay, there's like a slight discrepancy between like the fiat layer and the physical layer, but eventually machines will find their way to excess power, just in terms of supply and demand of that power. And I know this isn't like this is the opposite of like advice for miners right now. If you want to secure power in the US, obey the rules, get somebody like Bassload to help you interpret a 400-page like tariff and make sure you don't get yourself in trouble, and hedge yourself in the most sophisticated ways possible against the cost of power going up. That's all good advice for you. But then just thinking like stepping back long term, none of that stuff is going to matter. Like my hypothesis is that corrupt governments that are sitting on cheap energy, cheap in energy terms, cheap in terms of supply and demand, will exploit those resources for Bitcoin. And when they do, they will drive out of business Bitcoiners who are paying a lot for energy. And likewise for governments that are subsidizing energy, if they overly subsidize energy, Bitcoin will come in and eat up those subsidies as much as possible and drive those governments into insolvency, right? Like, it's like this purifying fire, Bitcoin. It's just going to eat through it's going to eat through any bullshit that creates a misalignment between physics, supply, and demand, and what is legally, regulatorily kosher.
Max BitBuyBit, you polite British gentleman.
I hear what Base is saying, I hear what Troy is saying, and I'm wondering if there's like a sort of middle ground. John, as you know, I like to bend rules if I can't break them. Ideally, I want as many small miners as possible to be able to compete. It's preferable, it's more decentralized, it's less attackable. I don't like this idea of only being able to compete if you have the economies of scale. So is there something where you can please the Greta Thunberg lovers by, for example, if you got a collective together of enough small scale miners to buy very cheap land that's not buildable or not livable, and potentially have like a load of solar that people bought collectively and could then put their miners there, something along those lines where it would bring the cost down, it would keep the Thunberg lovers happy potentially. When you were talking the other week, John, to, was it Dave?
Yeah, Dave of the
Desert Dave, and he was talking about getting these solar units down to like $30 a pop because he's getting them used. Presumably, if you're buying loads, you get them even cheaper. Is that like a pipe dream, or is that something where we could do something? Because we do have a fucking lot of plebs who do want to mine, and it is important to have them being able to do that. Is that a sort of middle ground, something along those lines?
I'd like to answer that question, or attempt to answer that question, Max, because it's a great one. And I think the underestimation available in the community, there are a tremendous amount of unicorn situations that miners do on a daily basis, right? I mean, you got guys, trying to build their own sovereign, mine where it's not connected to any grid, right? Totally disconnected. There's tremendous amount of people, doing that. Well, I wouldn't say tremendous, but there's a decent amount of the folks that we all kind of know and understand in the community that are trying to kind of opt out, right, of those rules and regulations that the Greta Thunberg, waves her iron fist on, right? But what I could tell you is that dealing with what I would consider a small miner, mining, there are different rates when you're mining for residential electricity consumption versus a commercial or industrial user of electricity, right? There's different rate structures just here in the US. I'm sure there is all over the world. And so that's an uphill battle in itself, right? Mining at your house versus mining, with a commercial meter or industrial meter is a total different thing. However, if you do these two things, you will please a lot of people in the energy industry. If you print the load, and when I say print the load, if you're saying you're going to consume a certain amount of electricity, consume it. Okay? And then if you pay at least one invoice, for crying out loud, just pay one invoice, right? And that invoice can be determined based on a strategy you've implemented with folks helping you do this, or a simple utility tariff that you like and you feel that it's cheap and it's around the clock electricity, right? And it's priced accordingly. Just pay the invoice, print the load, pay the invoice, and things will really turn out okay for you, okay? When I say okay, meaning you will please the Greta Thunbergs, okay? Because there's been a lot of folks obviously coming in. I want, 100 megawatts, 500 megawatts. I want all these megawatts. I want gigawatts, all this stuff. When you start using that type of request, you are niching yourself into a small bucket of consumers of electricity, the Lowe's, the Home Depots of the world, the Targets of the world, as a blanket example, that are asking for those types of purchases from suppliers and the like, right? So when Billy Bob Mining LLC asks for 100 megawatts, everybody's going to tilt their head to the side and go, I'm not sure about that, right? And then the sentiment gets created in the industry where it is quite ridiculous, right? Where we have people like myself trying to change and literally sort out and to do a complete 180 of the sentiment from electricity suppliers, utilities, and all of the folks alike, because Bitcoin miners are great consumers of electricity. They will, if they so choose, if the humans that are operating the Bitcoin mines will be willing to cooperate and do what they say they're going to do. Hey, Mr. Bitcoin miner, this is your retail electric supplier or your qualified scheduling entity who schedules your load into the grid. We would like you to shut off in the next hour. Can you do that? We'll actually pay you to do that. That's a unicorn thing, but we can talk about that. If they do this and you just are a good consumer of electricity, okay, back and forth mutually between all the parties, things get really good for you. In fact, I've had some folks get the red carpet laid out for them because they're actually doing that. And there's big miners, small miners that are doing just that, right? And it's a relationship. The relationship with the counterparties between retail electric supplier, utilities, there's things called qualified scheduling entities, which are just parties that schedule load in. They're responsible for scheduling it, right? And making the grid and the consumer kind of marry each other and have that relationship. There's other entities as well. Sorry, my family's screaming for some reason. If that is done, okay, it gets a lot better, right? But the folks that have come in and out and in and out, over the past, maybe call it 5 or 6 years now, that creates just a negative sentiment that is really hard to go back on, especially when people are defaulting. You're having folks just have accounts receivable that are very high, the suppliers, so it's just hard, and like I said, there's unicorn stuff that people are doing, but there's also stuff where if you just had the right strategy, right? If you're in a market that you truly know, you got folks in your side, the counterparties that are all on the same page, supplier, utility, consumer, all those folks. And if you just do what you say you're going to do with consuming electricity, there's no problems. My opinion.
Would you risk, as a miner, putting up a bunch of capital expenditures just on your invoice to prove to the electricity suppliers that, yes, I can pay, I've printed the load, I've paid a few invoices, can we talk now? Would you take that risk in certain situations, knowing that, okay, you prove it to us, then we'll talk?
I mean, I would. It's just like developing a relationship in any market between, business owner and vendors, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if you've been doing business with a particular vendor for decades, right, you're going to get unicorn stuff that maybe the next guy's not, right? And if that relationship has been passed down from, it's a family-owned business, let's say, and it's been passed down over the years, I mean, that relationship will continue to grow through generations, right?
I've heard this anecdotally, even from where I sit, that there's a lot of like local politics involved. That you can develop a good reputation, build relationships as a small miner, and be very well treated. So there's a kind of deals don't necessarily scale with your size, but it's more complicated than that. I'd like to, if I can, go back to Max's question about scale and whether there's some way to achieve distributed mining and avoid centralizing hash rate, and maybe at the same time use renewables, local renewables. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'm still not sure what the answer is. I think we need more technical developments we're not there yet. One of the things that kind of gets me excited about solar actually is staying in DC for the whole journey from the photovoltaic panel to the ASIC, because right now we convert AC, we convert DC to AC and then back to DC inside the miner, and there's efficiency losses there. And also, I didn't know this until about a year ago, but the typical solar generation facility has a lot more nameplate capacity than it actually delivers to the grid. And that's because it makes sense to buy undersized inverters that convert the DC power to AC to feed the grid, because you get a nice flat profile of output when you size down the inverter. So you say you set the inverter to only handle 2/3 of your maximum power output. Then during the part of the day where you're at or above that maximum, you have a nice flat output. But also, inverters are expensive, and you don't have to pay for a big inverter when you take the strategy. So it makes sense to kind of overbuild the PV and then underbuild the inverters. And that means there's all this solar power in DC form that never reaches AC and just gets stranded. There's different things to do about that. You could charge a battery with it, charge the battery in DC, and later feed the grid with it. And batteries are kind of standard with new solar generation, but there's a limited amount of that clipping that you can save with batteries, depending on the situation. So I think we're going to see, and we are starting to see, technical innovations that allow you to stay in DC, and that might, I'm thinking like solar installations of all sizes. It's going to be really hard in a house, but could be paired with a certain amount of mining. One of the companies I work with, Optimized Infrastructure, Ali Cheherzaz is this founder CEO. He has software that basically models out solar installations with and without mining, including capturing this DC clip power. And, it reduces the payback period for solar if you can mine along with it. The amount of mining, the amount of batteries that optimizes that construction, and how to split power on a moment-by-moment basis between ASICs, batteries, and the grid is a complicated modeling question. And that's kind of what the software does. But I do see a future for that, because in a way, the solar that is not feeding into the grid at all, for instance, or for that matter, as the grid itself achieves higher and higher penetration of solar, that solar power becomes worth less and less, because the demand of the grid doesn't match the solar production curve. So the sunniest point of the day, you're not using any more power, but now you've got all these solar panels feeding into the grid. You get what's called solar deflation. You get curtailment during those times. What's happening there is wasted power, and the amount of wasted power we're going to get is only going to increase as we throw up more and more solar panels. And the IRA and other incentive structures are encouraging more and more build out of solar. So this problem is only going to get worse. So as I see it, there's there's wasted solar power to be harvested by Bitcoin miners, and it should be basically free. The downside is that it's not there all day. And Bitcoin mining traditionally has been a 24/7 operation, and it's been that way not by choice, but because machines depreciate fast enough that even if you have free power, during a lot of times of our history as an industry, even with free power, you can't profitably mine if you only have 4 hours of uptime a day, for instance, because you won't pay off your machine in time before it's worthless. So I think that's changing too. The improvement for ASICs is slowing pretty severely. I think we are approaching the physical limits of chip design. I think we have a lot of gains left to be made in terms of cooling. There's a lot of design gains still on the table, but I think very few of them are going to come from where most of them have come from in the past, which is just shrinking the circuits on the chips. So that means that when you buy an ASIC, you might have a 5-year useful life for it, or even more. If your power is free, maybe even more. And so I'm pretty optimistic about the ability to go grab this excess power at a large scale or a small scale without sweating the uptime, provided we get the right hardware advancements, provided we get the ability to buffer the power in the appropriate way, or the ability to overclock and underclock as the solar intensity rises and falls. Ideally, that'd be the ultimate for efficiency. Cloud goes over and your machine just slows down, and then sun comes out, your machine speeds up. We need machines that are robust enough to handle that. But I'm optimistic about that kind of a way forward. And one other thing you mentioned real quickly was heat. And I agree with you that reusing waste heat is a scale limited thing, right? Nobody needs as much heat as Riot's Rockdale facility is producing. Like, they could heat, if that was like district heating, oh my God, they could heat Boston with that thing. Nobody needs that much heat in a small place. So needs for heat can be met with very small installations of miners. And if they provide an alternative revenue stream in a very, very low margin environment, that makes a difference to the bottom line and favors the smaller miner. Of course, on the other hand, we have efficiencies of scale, particularly when it comes to maintaining the machines, repairing machines, fetching them when something's wrong. The labor to send somebody down in the warehouse, like down a few rows and up a ladder to pull a machine and fix it, is very different from sending a repair person out on the highway and down into a suburb, into somebody's house, or into an apartment complex. Very different. So you get some economies of scale with mining, but you maybe don't have access to revenue streams that are limited in scale. And one more thing is, demand response participation is also going to scale down, and that'll be available to pleb miners. So the alternative revenue stream of we see big miners taking advantage of, not just price responsive curtailment of, but participation in programs. What is it? FERC Rule 2222 makes these distributed energy resources that are smaller in size able to aggregate and participate in these kinds of programs. I think we'll see more of that. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic and hopeful that pleb mining isn't just like a one-off with somebody heating their tub or drying their clothes, or just like an off-grid, like 100 acres ranch guy, like off-grid operation. But we'll have something in this intermediate scale that you're talking about that takes small, mid-sized solar installations or wind farms and throws Bitcoin miners behind the meter there to take extremely cheap energy that is otherwise not being used because our loads don't match our generation in this new high renewable penetration grid.
Troy, I think if we want to have our own electricity generation, all we have to do is not mention the word Bitcoin. I think that's where you do well, where you come into play. Because, the wordsmiths of the world, the people that know how to speak to EPA folks, to environmentalists, that, I think you do very well. You, Jen Orso, Andrew Bailey, even our buddy Hashing to Heating, you guys do a pretty good job of speaking that language, but you're on the right side. You're on our side, So you can say, listen, as far as coal remediation, well, you're already doing that. Why don't you allow somebody to come in who's probably going to make more money independently, not tied to the tit of government subsidies to get rid of this coal safely or get rid of these tires safely, but they're doing it on their own. Their profit model is their own. It's not dependent upon subsidies that do come from you. Oh, it comes from my tax dollars. Okay, well, I feel differently about that. That's where I think you guys do well.
That's very kind of you, but I just have to step in here because Stronghold is reimbursed by the state of Pennsylvania for that remediation.
It doesn't always have to be that way.
It doesn't have to be that way, right? I want to make the point that this bothers me so much with the critics of Stronghold. They basically elide the distinction between waste coal and coal, and they just see it as a coal-fired plant that is polluting the atmosphere. And they say, Bitcoin's destroying the planet. It's burning coal. They ignore that it's waste coal remediation, but more importantly, they ignore that that business would not be profitable without subsidies. And those subsidies are not for Bitcoin mining. They're for anybody to do this, right? It's like if you want to remediate coal, you could qualify for the subsidy in the same way. So it's frustrating because if you're just anti-subsidy, if you're anti-Bitcoin, it doesn't make sense to point to a state-sanctioned and sponsored Bitcoin miner, right? It's
All
like no, that's
energy is subsidized. If we didn't have the subsidies, we wouldn't have the same electric generation we have today. The end.
I
think
want to
what
make
you
a
have
point
to-
here, and I don't mean to cut you off, Troy, but we're getting kind of
No,
long.
go ahead.
I have an idea, everybody. So who's in it with me?
No.
Yeah, no. You just wait a minute, Max. This Centralia
The fire.
coal fire that's been burning since the 60s, I think there's an opportunity for us to mine Bitcoin there in some way. Base, you got to help us figure that out on a regulatory side. And Troy, you got to get the messaging out there for everybody that there's some way that we can sink in large amounts of water and then extract the steam power from it.
Love it.
We need some good engineers on this. Before we go to final closing statements, Base, you haven't talked in a while. Is there some messaging that you want to get out before we close things out here?
I don't need to talk, man. Sometimes you just got to listen. I love listening to Troy because, like I said, I mean, this kind of stuff really makes you think about, what does Bitcoin mining look 20 years from now, right?
Exactly.
What does it look like 50 years from now? What does it look like when I'm long gone, when we're all long gone, right? Our kids are even long gone, right? What is it actually going to look like? And I could tell you, can you guys hear me all right? Is the mic okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay, good. The electricity generation fleet mix is changing. Troy touched on that. And I wrote, if you guys really want to look at some really staggering numbers, you could read my info flows, specifically the one I released today. It is quite crazy what type of fuel mix that is being ushered in and what type of fuel mix is being ushered out. And I'm not like waving my hand like it's some kind of alarm, but the base load generation, the stuff that runs all the time, you don't need to ask it to turn on because it can be on. The demand for it is all the time. There's base load that runs consistently 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Okay. Maybe not 365, but because there's some maintenance involved, but it runs way more than some other fleet mixes that are out there. Right. So if that is changing, which it totally is, how do these industrial consumers of electricity, or even all the way down to somebody that wants to run an ASIC all the time, how do they function? It means that the way that they function is you're going to have to change the perception of how you operate that machine. Okay. Because to Troy's point, the sun doesn't shine all the time in every place of the world all the time. And the wind doesn't blow all the time. I'm sorry, folks. I don't make those rules. None of us make those rules. And they're rules. Okay. This is a problem for me because when you buy an ASIC, do you want to already buy this application specific integrated circuit, this machine that is hashing functions, okay, hashing nonsense? Do you want to buy it knowing that you're only going to operate at 60% of the hours of the year? Are you okay with that? Because ultimately, the generation fleet mix that generates electricity from energy resources like coal, nuclear, wind, solar, water, gas, natural gas, if the base goes out and the treble comes in, which it already does, and which it already is doing, and Troy even mentioned the mechanism that is ushering that fleet mix to change, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. Tremendous amount of money coming into the marketplace, and even though it's hard to get for most folks, it's available and you can go get it. You got to work to get it, but you can, and it's being implemented, right? So This is crazy. You know what I mean? Those, if that changes, you're automatically have to change the lifestyle of that machine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when you change the lifestyle of that machine, that currently right now, that thing is designed to run all the time. It's not really designed to do fancy curtailment strategies and demand response related stuff, right? I mean, it's forced to because, again, to Troy's point, you know, there's demand response programs, ancillary services you can provide back to the grid, and all these different things that the machine has to do it. In fact, there's, you know, firmware out there that is allowing those things to happen, and it's a good thing. Okay, but ultimately the thing is designed to run, right? It's kind of like a BMW is designed to run in the Autobahn.
There's
right?
some BMWs.
Hey, you know, but still, that's, you know, I just try to touch on that a little bit, just because, you know, nobody wants to buy an ASIC, in my opinion, that would automatically say and agree to and slap a high five to say, "Yep, I'm cool with the 65% uptime on this machine per year. I'm cool with that." I don't know about it. Just kind of, I tilt my head to that a little bit. So
Can I just jump in real quick here?
Sure,
This
Troy.
is like everything to me. I mean, this question is everything. How robust, first of all, how robust are machines that are designed to run with 100% uptime roughly, you know, when they're 65% uptime, and also not in just solid blocks, but lots of switching? And to what extent and can that be remediated, and how expensive would it be? That's like a technical question I don't know the answer to. I've been asking people about it for a long time. But another question or point I got to make here is that as I see it, price and uptime are two of your biggest, most important considerations to have as a miner, right? So if you say, would you buy an ASIC with 65% uptime? I'm like, no. What if your power is 0? And your alternative is to get 100% uptime, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay, let me do the math. Suddenly I'm open to it. Suddenly it's like, oh, well, maybe, you know, if it's free. Or what if it's like 1 cent? Okay. So, you know, I have on my board, I'm at my office. On the board behind me, I've got like a graph of exactly this curve, which, you know, I've kind of plugged through the spreadsheet, not including the failures to the robustness of the machine. But basically the question that every miner is asking themselves, which is, once the really cheap high uptime power is gone, how much of a reduction in price makes it worthwhile for me to take how much of a reduction in uptime? You know, and that's going to be like a graph. And I think that a year ago, 2 years ago, the answer was like, screw it. I won't take any reduction in uptime for any reduction in price, right? because uptime was all, because because the electricity was not a big part of the expense. It was mostly CapEx. But now that depreciation has slowed, CapEx is shrinking relative to OpEx as a percentage of your expenditure. It's like, let me calculate. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
It's an interesting proposition to bring up to miners to say, you know, you expected 100% uptime and you were able to calculate that all out based on a rate that you were given. But I wonder how many would take up on that. It's very tempting. If extremely cheap power, you're going to run into a number of different complications there, and spinning machines down and bringing them back up. But I see the potential in it all, that it is a possibility. But I also see the advantages of having a regulated structure. In some ways, I think there is an advantage to a vertically integrated structure. You know, everything's controlled by one entity, and you know what to expect. And then you have the really far out, you know, wildcat way of doing things, completely stranded. That's also fascinating as well. We're going to wrap things up. I actually have 3 pages of notes and questions here that I didn't even get to. And I think that's because this conversation was excellent, really. It come from 2 different ends of the spectrum as far as thinking about energy and Bitcoin mining. You've got the bass and you have the treble. And I think we did a good job of making some beautiful music together. Thank you, guys. Max, do you have anything to add before we head out?
No, that was really good. We need to keep the conversation going. I think there's some good points there, and I'm sure there's a way to weasel things for the smaller miners. We'll get there in the end. We will win.
We love weaseling.
We do.
Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was really, really fun.
John, can I leave a closing remark?
Absolutely.
I tweeted this, and I'll be brief with this. You know, we have the halving coming up. The revenue stream is going to be cut by 50%. And a lot of miners are talking about it. Okay. They're trying to understand what to do. And I would sound this voice to the folks that are trying to understand what to do. If you're able to be in a market where you can arbitrage electricity and you can train the ASIC to be, if not the best electricity trader that's available by computational work with this ASIC, and you have a market construct that allows you to function in that way, and the way you're doing that is through the ASIC mining Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the cherry on top, not the other way around. Not I have to mine Bitcoin and I'll worry about my electricity price later. Switch it around to become focused on electricity pricing, the market constructs available, and allow yourself to become, with this ASIC, a very sophisticated electricity trader by telling it what to do. There's programs out there that exist that can allow you to do that. In fact, you may, be sophisticated enough to build your own opportunity. Fine. Get in that mode, because electricity pricing, it's a marketplace. There's extreme volatility in certain markets, and there's some that are more stable. But if you say, I want to be electricity trader with this ASIC, and then Bitcoin is my reward, you'll thank me later, because you'll be having proof for multiple halvings to come. So when we talk about the long-term vision of Bitcoin mining, if you have that in the front of your mind and you're in a market that you can do this in, it's a great trade-off, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much for that, Base. There you have it. Become a sophisticated electricity trader by mining Bitcoin. Thanks, everybody. This has been swell.